ahead and start recording and get this meeting started. There might still be a few technical glitches along the way, so bear with us. I think if you turn the closed captioning on, I do know that portion is working, so you can read what I'm saying, and I will try to slow down a little for that to function well as well. I'm going to turn it over to the city so they can do some quick introductions, and then we'll get going with our presentation.
Well, good evening, and thank you all. Can you hear me? My name is Kevin Teague, and I'm the Deputy Director for Parks, Recreation, and Facilities. And we are very excited to have you all here tonight. Thank you, though, for those that came in person and for those that are joining us online. This is an exciting project, as you all know, and the addition of this park property will be a tremendous amenity to the city, and I know that we are all excited for that. This represents a large body of work that has happened in the last few months. We've had several public workshops, information booths at Earth Day, Farmers Market, concerts in the park, and most recently the Lunar New Year. Several surveys have gone out. We've had meetings with the Park and Rec Commission. We've had meetings with City Council and site tours. And so all of that information is now coalescing into these preferred plans, which we're really excited for you to see. So I'd like to start off by just introducing the team that's been working on this from the beginning. We'll start off with the team from the city. Our project manager is Shelby Peralt, and she's been assisted by Becky Smith throughout the whole project. And our consulting team from HBB Landscape Architects is led by Juliet Vaughn and assisted by Julia Baki. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to the team and let them walk you through what they've come up with.
Great, thank you. So, excuse me, we're going to go through a presentation first so that those online as well as in person can kind of hear the same information and background on our process. We're going to walk through the different park master plans that are proposed. These are still what we're calling preferred master plans, meaning they're not final. It's a coalition of all that we've heard so far and both the competing interests as well as trying to find the balance between all those competing interests. With the feedback we receive, we will make revisions and see what might need to be tweaked or updated or shifted around a little bit to respond to the comments we hear. And then we'll come back to the commission and council with the final master plan. So this is not your last time to offer feedback, but it is a really important one to make sure that we've been able to interpret what we've heard so far. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so most of you probably know where Beaton Hill and Big Rock are. We're talking about Beaton Hill Park up in the north and Big Rock Park South, part of the Big Rock Park systems. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Here's our timeline. So we have gone through the park programming. That was our last series of public workshops. Those when we saw the alternatives. We showed different concepts for each of these parks. And we took a little bit of a break to make sure we had some time to get some additional information on the residents. If you were part of those meetings, you recall there was some discussion about whether the residents should be kept or not. So we had a little bit of extra analysis on that building, a little bit extra time through the holidays. We all kind of saw that craziness. And so we're here in January, February, March in this period with our preferred concepts. And then, like I said, we're going to take the preferred concepts to SEPA review, make any final revisions, and try to finalize the plan towards the middle of the spring-ish. Go to the next slide. So our project goals, those of you who have been part of these planning process before, they basically remain the same. The idea is to really respect and educate and highlight the natural context that these parks sit within. So a place of respite, a way to connect, educate, to really bring people into this system that is so beautiful as it is. And we want people to be able to experience it. To make it safe and access for everyone, you'll hear a lot about accessibility, accessible trails, accessible playgrounds. And then to really think about that flexibility. So as we change, as our community changes, that we can have our parks adapt and change as well. I'm going to go through some of the summary from the last series of workshops. So you'll see the concepts that we showed. We named them the gradient, the whimsy, and the playful space for everyone. And then you can see here some of the things that we heard people tell us about what they liked or disliked about each of those parks. I would say some of the, natural trails, natural spaces, all of that was pretty universally supported and no surprise. It's kind of why we love these places as they are today. There was a lot of discussion about a dog park, and I think a lot of interest in both for a dog park and against the dog park. The concerns were really around noise, parking, and access. And so at the end of the day, between what we heard at the open house and what we heard online, there was a little bit more support for a dog park than against. And so we have worked that into the system at Beaton Hill. There was also a lot of support for universal play and universal play everywhere. So you'll see that at both parks as well. And a lot of discussion around gardens as well as pea patches. This is just a summary of the workshop from the in-person comments and a lot of those supports that we talked about, as well as specific feedback for Beaton Hill and Big Rock. Beaton Hill also had a lot of support for pickleball. And then Big Rock had the universal play, and we had a lot of discussion about those buildings, as I mentioned. And so retaining a lot of those buildings for use where we could use them for the community was really important to the majority of people. This was our online survey that we had at the same time. So this was open for about a month. And you can see 475 responses. So I think one of the things that's really unique about doing parks in the city here, often you see a lot of responses in that first meeting, but here you see a lot of responses at every single stage of the process. And so we love that it's always trying to keep people engaged, and it clearly shows that the folks here are still very engaged. Mostly live in Sammamish, and 38% actually live within a mile of the parks. I think you can see background in some of the age ranges. Really what we wanted to see is how well do the concepts proposed actually meet the hopes, the dreams, the ideas. And you can see that really all of the concepts ranked really high with really that we listened, that we were integrating the types of programming that people wanted to see. And then we asked specifically of the concepts themselves, also what kind of fit and what was starting to make sense and what we liked, and also still very high between the two. And so when you, at the end of the day, between what we heard at the open house and what we heard on the survey, there was not one single concept that was really strongly preferred, but a little bit of a lot of the concepts that people liked. All right, excuse me. We are going to start with Beaton Hill Park, and I'm going to pause quickly and just make sure our online is still going all well with our tech. Okay, so we'll see that that's still working. We're going to get through some of the presentation here, and then when I get through the concept, we're going to go ahead and pause for a question and answer period. When we do the Q&A, we're going to sort of jump back and forth between online comments and questions and those in the room. So bear with me, we're going to get through both parks so you can see what's proposed at each of them, and then we can kind of facilitate that discussion. So starting with Beaton Hill, you can see right off the bat, we are proposing to bring parking on site. That was really important through the previous process. The existing parking on Southeast 8th doesn't always function very well, and there's a lot of concerns with safety. So we are keeping that parking. However, we're going to change it so it's a back-end angled approach. What that does is it's a little trickier to back in, but as you get out, as you get your kids out, as you get dogs out, as you go get stuff out of the back of your truck, that's all a much safer environment. And then leaving is also will function a little bit easier because you can see who's coming as you're trying to get out. So it's generally considered a safer approach from traffic and just functionality. The parking on site will also help solve the problem of people just dead ending at the end of the road, because the actual parking lot will serve as a legal turnaround to go through and start to head back the other way. That parking on site will also have 35 stalls, so it will support additional parking, obviously for Beaton Hill, but for the Big Rock Park system as well. And then there's a second parking lot up at the north. As you're aware, Beaton Hill does have quite a bit of topography. So that parking lot at the north is really geared to accessibility and a couple of stalls for the main picnic shelter. That would be a group rentable picnic shelter up at the top of the hill. So if you imagine that large meadow kind of sitting up at the top with the shelter, being able to rent that, trying to get family and friends and gear and everything else, that parking up at the north becomes important for the functionality of that end of the park. There is a trail system. So what you see is the gray trail on the screen. That's the accessible route. Connects the top to the bottom. The top half of the park is also where we integrated the hillside play. So you saw pictures of that, and you'll see some other photos in a few minutes. So that's basically using the hillside for slides and climbing and things like that with an accessible route from top to bottom so that it's open to all. And then as you move to the southern half of the site, that's where you see the 4 pickleball courts. And if you recall, there was a lot of support for pickleball. We were debating between 2 and 4 courts, and when we were doing alternatives, 4 courts was preferred, and primarily because it allows you to actually do some leagues and really kind of enjoy the social aspect of the sport. So because of that social aspect, we have a little open space and a little plaza just off the courts. That's also where we located the restroom. And just south of that is the pea patch. So the pea patch is 40 plots. It has its own little shelter, its own kind of picnic tables within the pea patch enclosure, as well as a small tool shed. So, you know, you'll see social everywhere, right? We want to be social while we do the things that we love to do. And then that's all interconnected with the parking, with open space, more picnic and seating areas. Off to the north of the pickleball courts, and it kind of loops around the edge of 218th, that's where we located the dog park. So it's tucked back into the hillside. It's a little bit behind the pickleball courts. And the entrance is not too far off the parking lot with a small dog area, small shy dog, as well as a large dog. So it would be fenced. Both of the small and the large dog would have separate fencing. And then there's some maintenance access to allow for easy maintainability of the dog park itself. The other main component of this park in particular is all of the trail systems. So there's some brown trails that you see through the trees. And you also see a darker brown wetland boardwalk. This system currently has a large wetland and a stream, but it's pretty degraded. It visually just looks like a meadow, but it's actually a wetland around the pond and around the creek system as well. So part of the big approach to this park is to restore a lot of that environmental system. As we're restoring it, we have the opportunity to use that restoration as the mitigation to bring in the boardwalk and allow education, kids, and experience closer to that system. And then we'll interconnect the wetlands with the new stream corridor. We want to go to the next slide. We've got some images of what some of these features look like. So you can see the hillside play. The whimsical elements was one of the things that people really loved about the earlier concepts. So we brought that in as well. And then the dog park and what some of those other facilities could look like. All right, we want to talk about phasing today. So if you go to the online at the end, we'll show the link and help direct you there. But we really want to find out what facilities and what types of improvements we want to see happen and what if any are the priorities from the community. So we've broken this into a couple of different phases by color. Total construction is over 10 million for everything. And that's a really high cost, but it's also the construction, it includes literally everything that you would see on the plan. So what we're trying to do is break this into manageable pieces. The red area is what we're calling South Park improvements. And I should also say that regardless of which improvements might go first, there's sort of some core improvements of infrastructure, parking, things like that that need to happen just to open the park up. So beyond that, this would be what would be in each of these different phases. So it would include the south parking lot, regardless really of which phase might go in first, but it's shown in the red phase for ease of just clarity of the graphic. It would be the off-leash park, the pickleball courts, the pea patch, kind of that whole southern system of the core sort of more physical improvements and programming of the park. What we're calling the North Park improvements would actually be that northern parking lot and the picnic shelter and the trail that would connect top to bottom. And then the nature trails would be the soft surface and the rest of the environmental system through the wooded areas. The restroom itself is likely to go with the North Park improvements, and that is primarily because the utility access has to come off of 218th. So there's some sort of infrastructure sort of limitations with how we get some of those utilities into the system. All right, I'm going to move on to Big Rock, and then we can come back and forth. We've got a pause here first. Now I have tools. All right. laser pointers. People online might not be able to see this though. So on Big Rock Park South, you can see on the, I have to think of my left and rights now, the left-hand side is the whole park. And then this dashed line that you see on the plan is the enlargement off on the right-hand side. Okay, so if we're going to start on the right-hand side with this enlargement, so you can see 20th down at the southern end of the park. The parking was really well supported by all. And so there was a number of different parking options originally. We looked at one that really maximizes the ability to provide parking, but fit within the context of the site a little bit better. And that's what we heard was important to the community. So it kind of meanders along the edge. It provides a significant amount of parking as well as some drop-offs. And I'll jump to this larger plan. Whoops, nope, is a turnaround at the end. So that turnaround is important both as you're trying to find parking and need to come back, but also for emergency access, as well as getting access up to the barn itself. So if it's used for, as it's used for events, there's space and ability to get services and equipment and other things into that barn area. The open meadow remains as an open meadow. That becomes that informal field. That's kind of similar to what you saw before. And then the interconnected system of all of the buildings. So what you'll see here is we are proposing all of the buildings remain, except that old garage. The old garage is removed. It's in the wetland buffer now, and is probably the least structurally sound of all the buildings. So that gets replaced with a central picnic shelter. One of the main elements of that we heard from the previous meeting is it really helps enclose that whole space. So those of you who are at the site tour, you really kind of arrive and you have this beautiful sense of enclosure with all of the structures. So we'll replace that with a structure that allows more direct access through to the gardens and the pond beyond, as well as provides a function for group picnic. The residence and the pool house remain. Those are smaller meeting spaces. The pool house itself has a more indoor, outdoor sort of event opportunities. And then the barn remains as well for those small or larger events. Accessibility to all of them with the exception of the second floor of the restroom, or sorry, the second floor of the residence would be mostly just for storage because we can't get accessibility up to that space. There is a new restroom proposed. It's a little hidden, so I'll try to point it. It would be at the north end of the new garage, which is turned into a maintenance garage for parks maintenance staff. And so what we do is we tack on a new restroom, so we have a publicly accessible outdoor restroom. So when the buildings are not in use, there's still a restroom available for the rest of the park use. All right, one of the other major functions of this park is the universal play. So we have that located in the open lawn between the existing orchard and the pool house. The purpose and what really makes the universal play unique is the inclusivity, right? So it's not just structures, it's gardens, it's open space, it's sensory, it's playfulness, as well as play itself. And so that really lets it appeal to kids of all ages, but more importantly, also kids of all abilities. So it's a really unique way of designing a playground. And it doesn't just look like one big structure. So the other benefit we saw to this, from what we heard from our comments, is that you really have the opportunity to integrate it into that garden kind of feeling that is currently, you really see in the park. All right, a couple other things to note before we move on. We are maintaining a lot of those gardens in the open lawn as event spaces. We really want to support and enhance those gardens to educational purposes. So that's where you get the specialty gardens, the sensory gardens, the ability to educate about what plants are there and to really maintain it and sort of highlight the plants that are in this space. And then the trail system is a series of interconnected loops. So again, the white trails that you see would all be the accessible ones, small and large loops. And then a main trail that connects all the way from Big Rock South through Central and North will have one interconnected trail system. A lot of the existing trails on the park will remain. The only trails we're removing are ones that are currently directly through wetlands. So we need to preserve and restore the environmental functions. And then we are retaining the disc golf course. So it's a 9-hole. We're calling it optional because there's still some design work that would need to happen to make sure it fits and to also make sure we can do it in a way that avoids conflict with other trail users or the natural environment. So And that's work that would still happen at a future phase. We don't want to lose the opportunity to consider it and to still recognize that it's a desired use. It's just a little bit more optional to make sure that we can actually fit it before it would actually anything would get installed. There is a couple of trails that would likely be removed if that disc golf course does go forward. All right, the rest of the wetland system would be restored, and that central pond meadow is the one that would remain very much as it is today. There'd do some work to help resolve some of the flooding issues, but it would be maintained as more of an open space that you see today. Let's go to the next slide. So here you see some of examples of what universal play could look like: the gardens with education and signage, the whimsical elements, the disc golf, and that picnic pavilion. All right, we're going to go through some of the buildings because we did able to really take some time and think about what the buildings could look like and also how they would fit the intended uses. That was a big component we heard. If you're going to keep them, make sure we can actually use them. So this is the barn. What you see in the floor plan, so that sort of diagrammatic plan up in the middle, is basically a layout as if it was the example I would use would be the wedding, right? It could be a large conference, it could be a large set of meetings, but if you imagine a typical wedding with those round tables, so this is where we sort of look at what that capacity could potentially be. And the photo examples on the right-hand side are pretty similar examples of barns turned into those kinds of spaces. So we open up the middle a little. There's a couple of existing stalls that would get removed. We carve out some space for accessible restrooms and a prep area. And then we really bring in a little bit more grander entrance with an arbor around the edge. You can see the picture. This is the one building. We kind of showed an example rendering of what it could look like. And then some example images. I should say also that in the site plan, the barn has an open plaza space off to the north. So that allows indoor and outdoor and the ability to expand the use even further as well, with a covered shelter off in that direction as well. And you see that on the site plan. That's this sort of additional space here does not exist today. And that would be a covered add-on to what would be considered the backside of the barn. All right, the next building is the residence. So there was a lot of discussion about the residence. It is an older structure. It does, it's beautiful if you see the woodwork and just kind of the history in that building. But it does flood, and there were some concerns about the structural, just what it would take and if it could actually support the intended use. And so we did do an additional structural analysis and find that it is feasible. And so we looked at what it could be used for, and you can see the layout. Essentially in the site plan in the middle, each of these would be an individual chair. So it's set up similar to the room is here, where you could have small meetings. You could still do small tables and chairs, but you're not going to have anywhere near the same capacity as you do in the barn. It does still keep the outdoor lounge. The porch was a really kind of sort of emotional space that a lot of people loved. And so the porch would still be there and accessible. We would make it accessible through a ramp system on the kind of the far side. And then basically just integrate it in much the same way as it's integrated into the site today. All right, the pool house is what's shown at the top. This is a very small meeting space. You see our capacity on these maps, like 15 to 20 people, kind of max. So you're thinking a really small group would work lovely here. What we did then to offset it is we created a larger outdoor event. So where the court, the sports court currently is, would actually be an outdoor plaza. So you could have tables and chairs and things set up out there. And we actually also, whether it's completely covered or just a trellis, we expanded that outdoor space off to the side. So you can see in this example, you could have events and other things also spill into that space. And then it is integrated on the backside would be the universal play. So you have a little bit of protection through the building itself, kind of from that space. And then it has the lawn just beyond on the site plan to also have additional spillover space. So you could prep in the pool house and rent the open lawn and have your event outside as well. And the new garage is shown below. So that would be what's turned into a maintenance shop and maintenance for park staff. It is, so one thing to this that was important is no one wants to walk into the main central park space and see like the garage, right? So we would basically flip it so the garage doors are on the back side, nearest to the parking, right? So you have easy access to the parking. And then that front space is where you would do arbor, benches, other kinds of things to really sort of make that feel like it's part of a central plaza. All of the solar panels will stay both on the garage and in the barn. So you still have a lot of educational opportunities around the solar purpose as well. All right, phasing for Big Rock South. What we've done here is kind of looked at the core of the central park as a single phase. So that would be the open meadow, the sort of pond area, which helps us control some of that flooding, the maintenance garage, and the picnic pavilion. We've taken the buildings themselves, the rest of the buildings, and called that its own phase. So that would be meeting and event areas. So that'd be the barn, the residence, and the pool house. And then we've broken the Universal Play as kind of its own little sort of pocket park off in the corner. So that's kind of a nice, easy piece that we can break out as its own phase as well. And then the green is the trails and the restoration. So that would be the rest of the trail system. There are some trails that would be likely kind of interconnected right off the bat, right? So there's a little bit of prep work and access just to be able to get access to the trail system that's there now and do at least the connection through to Big Rock Central. But the rest of the trail system, as well as the restoration associated with those wetlands, would be part of that trails and restoration phase. And that's where I get to pause. So this is the point where we'd like to have a bit more of a discussion and allow some Q&A. If there are any questions from the audience here in person first, we can just raise some hands and shout them out, and I'll repeat them for those who might be listening in. And then we'll probably ping pong back and forth a little bit between some of the questions and comments we might hear from online. We'll start with in-house here. Do you guys have any questions or comments? Yeah, in the back. It'll be, so the question is, what would the trail surfacing be? Basically in the plan, and if I could have some help, maybe bring one of the plans up front here. And if you want to go to maybe just the Big Rock Park plan, we can use that one as an example for most of the questions. So the ones you see in white versus some trails you see in brown, and it might be a little hard to see. We can show you closer up too, for those of you in the room here. The white trails would be basically concrete or asphalt. Those would be hard surface. And that provides the full accessibility to all of the core recreational improvements that are proposed. The rest of the trails would be a combination of gravel or mulch. There's some sort of larger main trails that the one that connects all the way through all the Big Rock Park system would be wider and probably more of a crushed rock. A lot of those existing smaller trails would stay mulch. Woodland trails in Beaton Hill would be mostly mulch, right? They're kind of going up the hill and through the trees. And then there's just one larger paved trail that would be concrete or asphalt that kind of connects the rest of the park together. Yep. Other questions from the room? Yeah. Give me a couple first and then we'll come back. Yeah. Good question. So in Beaton Hill, we have 35 stalls in the main parking lot off of 8th and an additional 9 stalls up at the top of the hill. If I do the math, I could be wrong. 44. I have to think about this. And then in Big Rock South, there is, I gotta find my little cheat sheet from my notes for how many parking stalls, 55 stalls in Big Rock South. Now in Big Rock South, yes, so there is an additional 18 stalls on Southeast State Street. I'm not even gonna try and do the math, but somebody could probably do the math and help out with that total answer. The short version is for Beaton Hill, there's a sufficient amount of parking for the programmatic uses that are at Beaton Hill and really for that spillover to Big Rock North. It's a decent amount of parking for the uses proposed. Now, if it's the middle of 4th of July and the local dog group is having a function and the Pea Patch group all wants to have a cleanup day, and there's, a educational element at the Overlook, and all of the shelters are rented. It might still be a little tough, but there's a decent amount of parking between all of the parking stalls here. Big Rock South, we recognize if there's events in all of those buildings at capacity, there is not enough parking on site. As those events would happen, parking and parking solutions, shared parking, considerations for parking off-site and shuttling would be part of larger events that would happen at the park. The day-to-day, when those buildings are not all in use, there should be sufficient parking for all of the functions that are at the park itself. It's a reasonable amount of parking for really no significant, like there's no ball fields, there's not anything that would draw a ton of people all at once, unless there's those events that are happening by the community. Does that help answer? Yep, so this is stormwater to support the paved surfaces of the parking. We do have an indication, and one of the benefits of having the parking come all the way through is because we could use the open meadow as overflow parking as well. So we've really tried to think through all the ways we could be as flexible as possible with how this system would work for parking. And it really just depends on how big those events are, and if everyone happens at once. But that also has the ability to be controlled somewhat by actual rentableness, the programming of the rentals of that space as well. That was kind of a long way of saying I think they got it. There might be some questions online. Yes.
Can you please discuss what the buffer along the edges of the property is going to look like?
Yeah. So the buffers are along the edge of the property, and this is really for both Beaton Hill and Big Rock. We basically set all the uses in so that we have enough space to provide a fairly developed natural buffer. So native Northwest plantings, trees, understory, it's intended to be a fairly strong visual buffer between, and that's really around all of the adjacent residences for the park. The one exception to that on Beaton Hill, which maybe you might want to flip to, we still allow a buffer between the dog park and the street as well. It's a little bit narrower because we have just a tighter amount of space, whereas pretty much all of the rest of the buffers have a really good hefty amount. There is still a buffer. There's some residences across the street, so we still want to provide a buffer regardless. It's just not quite as wide as the other areas. Do we have another question online?
Yeah, how will decisions be made regards to sequencing of phases?
All right, you're gonna have to say that one more time for me.
How will decisions be made in regards to the sequence of the phases?
Okay. So the phasing itself, one of the main components of the online survey and for tonight as well, is we'd really like to hear what priorities the community has for the improvements that we're showing. We broke them into areas that we felt were pretty reasonable, but it's an open discussion and comment to hear from you guys. The decisions ultimately will come as funding is available. So how much funding is available for design and construction will have a big play on what happens first. There are also some just core base level improvements that need to happen in order to open a park for the public. So making sure there is some of that buffer to adjacent neighbors, making sure there's parking, making sure there's some basic services available for people who do go, some accessibility. And then beyond that, we're looking for comments and feedback. The decisions ultimately rely in council as to what is funded with what available funding sources might be. Are there other questions from the group here? Yeah. So the question is, we mentioned garden areas with signage, and the question is really where would they be, if they'd be contiguous or if they'd be all over. We're basically focusing in a couple of core areas for what those signage programs would be. If I go into this core area here, we have kind of what we're calling more of an entry garden right by the entry plaza space that's nicely connected to the large space right next to it. That's what we're calling the event lawn. That has a number of established beds that could be enhanced as well. So you have a little bit of opportunity for some more mature plants already that are beautiful specimens, as well as an understory that can be expanded and enhanced to support additional garden and sort of, more specialty botanical type plants. The other area that we would really like to have that function is in the universal play, which is also like, it makes a really easy, simple circle, all close in and all accessible, to have some additional sensory, pollinator, kind of more of those specialty gardens that appeal to kids for tactile or hearing or things that can really get a lot of those other senses engaged. Is there a follow-up question? Go ahead. I think there's a lot of opportunity for those partnerships. I think that it stays open, that it has an educational component, that it is maintained and stays maintained. And I think those partnerships could certainly continue to be discussed. Do we have another question here? Yeah. We are in the process of doing some of those estimates. We've just got in some of the estimates for the restrooms and the buildings themselves. Oh, sorry, the question, thank you. The question was, are we going to be estimating the annual operations and maintenance cost for these parks? So the answer again is we are in the process of doing that. We don't have it established for all of these parks just yet. As we get refinement and make sure that there's no major changes needed to the preferred plans, then we'll be able to go ahead and finish those off. Question here? All right, the first question was, at one point in the concepts, we had an amphitheater proposed. And so what is the status of that? And is it somewhere else? And then the second question was, just from a traffic and an alternative modes of transportation, how are these parks going to be interconnected? So hopefully not everybody feels the need to drive. Okay, let's take the amphitheater first. We heard a lot of support for the amphitheater during the master plan process, particularly at the open house. When we start looking through some of the comments, the survey, and some of the follow-up discussions, a lot of concern with the amphitheater was really the size and the space and the limited parking that actually is available for yet more dense programmed kinds of functions. And there are a lot of adjacent residents that were also concerned about the noise as well as the traffic impacts. So it was pretty universally accepted that an amphitheater is needed and really desired in the community. It was determined this is probably not the best place to have that function. We did really also heard from a lot of people that we liked some of the photos that we showed of really much more informal gathering and seating along a hillside. It's not an amphitheater. You're not going to have a band, or you're not going to be amplifying music with a very large crowd. But we did still keep that core principle of just engaging with the hillside and being able to sit and enjoy the view. And so at Beaton Hill, right here, about midway down the slope, there's basically just some very informal seating so you can hang out and enjoy the view. Like a small group of people could hang out, but it's not big enough to have anything major happen. Okay, the second question was the interconnectedness. So for all of these parks, basically basic street frontage improvements would be part of them. So for example, during the master plan process and all the alternatives, we heard a lot about concern of walking on 218th. It's a big hill. It's not very comfortable. You can't see very well all the time. So a full streetscape with a protected planting strip and a sidewalk would be proposed. And then as well as Southeast 8th, the park side of that street improvement would also have sidewalks and planting strips. On Big Rock, you basically already have a portion of a sidewalk along the south side now, but as part of this project, that would also have to be improved with a larger sidewalk as well as a protected strip. So there's a bike lane on 20th right now that would remain. You'd have a wider sidewalk that's a bit more protected. And then Southeast 8th and 218th would also have wider sidewalks. Bikes, I believe, would still be on street. Do we have any more questions or comments from online first, and then we'll jump back to the room?
Yes, we have a question Are you going to be developing both sites at the same time, or is there a specific timeline for each site? So if you want to start this question, and Shelby, if you want to add anything else at the end.
Yeah, so part of the reason we're asking priorities is because we recognize that these sites are a lot of improvements. They're fairly big sites, and parks can cost quite a bit to implement. So the phasing is not likely to happen all at the same time. And what we're trying to do is start to get the idea of priorities so we can start to focus discussions on budgeting, grant opportunities, and other ways to start to get funding for design and construction. Shelby?
Yes, and I would add to that that we are getting ready to start our 6-year PROS plan update, which is our Parks, Recreation, and Open Space plan. And during that process, there are a number of opportunities for public outreach for you to voice your opinion to keep these projects as a high priority project so that we can make it a priority on our capital improvement plan.
Great. We had another question in the room.
If it does happen to go in, is it infrastructure then part of it go back out? Is it through big kinds of conflicts, or if it doesn't have enough?
Okay, so for the question from the room is really around disc golf as a potential use for Big Rock Park South. And both, how does that function with all of the events that potentially could happen? Is there conflicts and sort of how would that interplay occur? And then also, if it does get installed, is the infrastructure such that it would be difficult to pull out if it turns out that there are more conflicts than anticipated? So for Big Rock, and maybe we can change the screen and I can repeat this a little bit on the online. Here we go, that works. So the majority of the discs, so all of the programmed events are really in the central core. There could be a little bit of spillover into the meadow, but the meadow is really intended as a passive kind of space. So all of the disc golf would really start once you hit the trail system to the north. And a portion of it would need to also be in Big Rock Central. I think we're looking to try and get 9 holes. 3 of those holes would have to be in Big Rock Central. So we're not looking for a full course. That allows some activity to occur, but we don't have to squeeze them in tight enough where we would potentially start to raise those conflicts even further. And then we've spaced them. So there's really just a little bit around some of the central edges and mostly into the trail system to the north. It would be important as it's designed. The way you design a disc golf course is you have a tee and you have a basket, right? And you have what's called the fairway in between, similar to golf terms. The kicker with the disc golf is that you really need the tee, the place you start, to be close to a trail system, but you got to be able to throw your disc away from any trails. Rarely do people start throwing discs behind them. I've tried golfing. I can actually hit the golf ball behind me, it turns out. It's a little harder to do with a disc. I'm not kidding. I actually hit it behind me. So it is in how you set the baskets, how you set long fairways versus shorter, where you actually have to stop and do a shorter turn so that you create a bit more technical elements in the course as opposed to really long routes, which has more risk of that disc going in different directions. This is why it really has to get designed to see if it works in the configuration and the space that's there. And that's just a final design element that we don't have as part of the initial master plan. The second part of that question was the infrastructure. It's basically a concrete pad, like with almost like a pitcher's mound, right? It's a concrete pad with a stripe. That's all the tee is, and a sign. And the actual basket is equally just a post and a metal basket. So the infrastructure is very minor. It has very little impact on the environment around it. And the trail system to get from disc, like, tee, or what's it called, par to par, course to course, is just a small, like, walking trail through the mulch. So the infrastructure is very little. If it didn't work out, it would be fairly simple to remove. It would also be hard to remove if there's a lot of demand for it. The beauty of it is you can also easily modify them. It is easy to say, oop, this one is not working so well. You can pull it up and shift it a little and really fine tune those different courses.
And the demand
Yeah, that's a good point. There would just be a couple of holes. Most people don't tend to start in the middle of a disc golf course, but I think that's a fair consideration in how those holes ultimately might be located. They would ideally still be close to the Big Rock North edge. And there's kind of a woodland area and a little bit of that open meadow on the far side of the park. That's likely where those couple would happen. Yeah, but there's a forested, kind of a little bit of that forested area. Yeah. Yep. Yep. So sorry for those online. The question is just really like where would it go? And a lot of that's kind of up in the air, but the location of where those 3 holes that would likely be on Central is kind of to the south of, it's hard to say, it's Big Rock South Central, right? To the south side of Central and the north side of north of South. Oh my goodness. We can point to it on a map for the people who are here. The people online will just have to kind of guess and follow up with questions. Is there any more questions from online first?
Yeah, we have 2 regarding the programming of the buildings, so I'm going to ask them together. So the first is there any consideration for dedicated senior center activities? And the second question is, did a nature center or children's museum come up? This could increase programming at the Treehouse and Big Rock Central. Do we need all buildings to be for events and meetings?
Good questions. The senior center, Shelby, you might be able to help with a little. Right now, we're basically have the flexibility in the master plan to designate like how much space and what the occupancy could be. We're not trying to specifically define a program or a user or a dedicated space to anyone. Those discussions could certainly continue to be part of a public process, but not necessarily part of the master plan. We wouldn't likely get that resolved at this stage in the process. Shelby?
I would agree with that statement. And as we have funds allocated for future improvements and we get into that more detailed design, that's when those conversations would continue about any potential for dedicated spaces.
One of the things we did hear throughout this process was just really an interest in senior spaces. A puzzle room, I think, was brought up and things like that. So whether it's truly like 100% dedicated, but other things that were discussed was it's like a Sunday is senior day, or I don't know, maybe it's like Wednesday is senior day, whatever it ends up being. But that there's a lot of opportunity to be flexible with how these spaces get used. Did that cover both questions or only one question? I now forget.
The second question was about a children's museum.
Children's museum and nature, like a nature museum of some kind. So there were a lot of different ideas for how the space could potentially be used. I think it's a very similar answer in that there's a lot of opportunities. The likelihood of sort of a single dedicated sort of space that has like entrances and, you know, a more kind of defined program and control around it would probably be a little difficult with the ramifications and the requirements of the property as it gets turned over to the city. That doesn't preclude an opportunity for nonprofits to use the space, to have agreements for, like particularly in the universal play and children's gardens and children's museums have a lot of similarities. So there's certainly some overlap, but a true like dedicated pay your admission kind of a use is not likely at these spaces. We did hear a lot about art galleries, using it for temporary artist spaces, using it for temporary exhibition type spaces. So like a temporary children's museum space. Those types of things could certainly be potential partnerships in the future for essentially events or an extended event, but not a permanent type of a use. All right, we got a question in the room. Yeah, so the question is there a restroom in the barn? Yeah, so thank you for asking the question. I didn't get into quite that level of detail, but the question is, would there be a restroom in the barn and where you're having those events? There would be restrooms and accessible restrooms in all of the buildings. Part of the improvements that are needed is for every building has to have its own individual interior designated restrooms and more than one. I will say, I think maybe not all of them have to have more than one, but I think they're like, the residence is the only space that might not have more than one restroom just because of the configuration of the building. Yes, from the room.
Various very intense activities that
So the question is, with all of the intensity of the potential events and the uses that we're programming for these two parks, how is the reservations going to be handled? Is there an on-site attendant or an office? Kind of the management of those parks, how is that going to happen and function? Part of the reason we do operations and maintenance costs with these parks is that we can start to identify if additional staff is going to be needed to actually adequately maintain the infrastructure that we're proposing to put in place. So part of ramping up programming, maintenance, administrative kinds of services that are important in really having successful parks and activities in parks. That is all part of kind of that longer term process of funding. So as an improvement is funded, they also need to start to consider how the maintenance and all the support associated with that funding occurs. I think I asked the question again, didn't I? They're looking at me like maybe I didn't repeat the question. Is there anything else from online that we need topics to discuss?
Yes, would you be willing to discuss the safety concerns on Southeast 8th in regards to the parking and how we approached the design there to eliminate those concerns?
Yeah, so Southeast 8th was a lot of discussion during the open houses and really at kind of every step of that outreach process. What we heard a lot from the community is it just doesn't feel safe. We heard from the neighbors that people just kind of stop in the middle of the road and you're trying to get home. We heard from the people who do use the parking that it just never feels safe. People don't park always really well. Cars are going through. You can't always see you're trying to get out. And in particular with this park, now that we're creating more activity across the street, how do we keep that crossing safe as well? So a lot of the research and a lot of kind of just how you treat public spaces and safety within the street in the right-of-way environment. And the analysis from our design team, basically, as well as so the professionals, engineers that we have as part of our consultant team, as well as the city staff and their department staff, that's where we came up with the angled back-in parking. So if you do straight-in parking, someone could stop and have to back in, or they could come straight in, and there's not really a control of which way you do that. That makes it really hard when you're entering and leaving because you can't really see and you don't know if someone's backing out or coming straight in. So there's some problems with how that functions and how just that the size and the degree of the turning movements kind of swings further out into that street. So it can often, particularly if you're not a great parker, I'm also not a good at parking all the time. But what ends up happening is they end up taking up even more than just half the road and block whole road trying to get in and out of a parking space. And that's kind of the anecdotal that we hear that's been happening in this area. So what the angled back end does, two things. Essentially, as you're backing into a space and forcing people to back into a space, as soon as you open that door, you're automatically creating a bit of a barrier between everybody in the back of your car and that street in front of you. So kids get out of the car and go running. They're not running into a door. They're going to run into the park, right? So that barrier, as informal as it is part of what makes the angled back in a little bit safer than just a straight head in, a nose in. Because when you nose in and open your door, now your kid's got nowhere to go, right? Or a dog or grandma or anybody else that gets out of the car. So that was really one of the key functions. The other thing we heard is people are bringing things to the park. And so you're opening your back door and you're standing in the middle of the drive aisle trying to get things in and out of the back of your car. And so that back end angled parking helps reduce that as well. I think the last thing we really heard was the turnaround and that people just don't know where to go when they get out because there's no legal spot to turn around. So this does forces you out towards a single direction. You do need to use that parking on the other side to be able to have a legal turnaround. Those two kind of go hand in hand. The change to the back and angled could occur before the parking is in place. You would still have the problem of people getting to the end of the road and having to turn around in the road. So there might be some transitory transitions and time of transition as improvements occur over time, but that'll be something that'll just have to get worked out. The last thing I'll approach to this is the crossing, because I didn't mention that when we were talking through. So we have two crossings. There would be pedestrian crossings, one at the intersection. So that's kind of a standard crossing, safe crossing and crosswalks. The one that needs a little bit more careful consideration is the mid-block. So at the end of the on-street and the end of the parking lot, we're proposing a connection. And what that does is it connects directly to the restroom and more closer to some of the play elements that are the nature play in Big Rock North. that crossing has to be carefully designed as well. So right now we're just showing it, but at the time it comes to design, it's treated differently. It's visual. It is far enough away to be able to have sight distances around it. There's a whole very precise set of design criteria to make sure that that crossing is safe. And all of those criteria and what level of improvements happen would be part of that final design. All right, is there another question from online?
We have a comment about the whimsical elements and concern about them being like plastic or artificial materials, or being maybe like bright yellow, orange, not blending in as well with the natural setting. Can you talk a little bit about what those might look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of the whimsical elements that people are drawn to in the photos we mostly showed were more natural materials, things that might be discoverable in the woods, things that kind of feel adventuresome and kind of create a little bit of interest and almost like that treasure hunt that you might go on. The idea with those whimsical elements are really likely more of a public art project, more of something where it's something that is an installation. It's something that has a community process in and of itself for kind of the character and the tone. It's not, it's intended to be a little bit more to fit in the context. There might still be some bright colors because you want to see it, but sometimes it's like that pop of something that really catches your attention that makes it whimsical. I think ultimately before, again, final design has a lot of variability in it. So there's a lot of discussion that has to happen before something gets installed. But I think kind of thinking through and as part of this master planning, we intend to define that character and the intent to keep it more in the natural side because of the context that they're going in. I will say one example of a whimsical element, very specific, that we do want to call attention to is there's a lot of discussion of the stained glass in the chicken coop for anyone who is out on the site. It's a perfect example of taking the stained glass and creating a whimsical element out of it, right? It could be a little house that is visible or a little archway or something that could really be playful and fun and engage with, but you're not going to take the whole chicken coop. Right? So that's a good example of something that would be whimsical and fun, but fit within the character of a very natural kind of park. Is there any more comments or questions from in the room? Yeah. So the question is infrastructure regarding irrigation. What would be irrigated at the site? It's a good question. It's a little detailed for a master plan, but essentially the only lawns that are intended to be irrigated are the main activity lawns in the core areas of the park. So the example from Beaton Hill is there's a lawn, an open lawn, excuse me, an open lawn shown near just north of the parking lot and next to the pea patch. That would be an irrigated lawn. The rest of the space would be open meadows. Big Rock South, the example is there's the meadow, right? The meadow would stay a meadow that would not be irrigated. But some of the core areas around the park itself, around the rest of the buildings, those areas would likely have some irrigation. Yes. Yeah, it's the tricky part. So the question is, if you're going to do phases and you do a portion of a phase or a portion of the park, how do you keep people, or do you have to keep people out of the rest of the park? And I think the concern is you don't want to sort of have, I don't know, you put in the playground, but the playground's got a chain link fence out of it because you don't want anyone anywhere else in the park would be more of an example of the concern. So that's kind of why we are prefacing the phasing by saying there's a core level of phasing that needs to happen just to open a park up for construction, right? You got to have something accessible. You got to have a place for people to park. You got to have, some core elements to that. So it might be a porta potty instead of a restroom, but there would be some facility in order to open the park up. That allows the phases to occur without having to close anything else off. So there might be some signs that say this is a native protection zone, right? You might have a couple of signs just to indicate and remind people that this is not a place you should be going. There might not necessarily be a fence around everything though. Is that probably kind of a fair statement? Okay, Shelby's nodding her head over there, so I know I'm doing good. Is there any comments from the online?
Yeah, we have a concern about crime around the parking areas on Southeast 8th as well. And was wondering if you could expand a little bit on crime prevention and design and how lighting can be a part of that.
Awesome. There is, particularly with Big Rock Park South, knowing that there is some events occurring and an intent for some events, there is some discussion about really how these parks will be managed. And if there are events, what's going to happen, right? So both for Big Rock South and Beaton Hill, we are at least having the cost estimate to have the parking lots lit. Okay, what that allows us to do is make sure people are safe when they're going to and from those events and can get to the cars. Part of that also is a placeholder to ensure that there's some budget and some considerations for lighting some of the main connecting paths to those event spaces. Potentially to the pickleball as well. We have an sort of an allowance for potential lighting of the pickleball courts. So connecting the pickleball courts to the parking lot would also then potentially be part of that lighting program. Lighting is a great tool for crime prevention when it's associated with activities and when it's in a visible space from roadways and other places. If you have a fairly dark path and you just light the overlook and you can't see the overlook, that then becomes an attractant because I've got lighting and no one can see me. So that's really the main element of crime prevention that we need to avoid. And that's what crime prevention through environmental design is, a whole sort of system of principles to how to design parks and public spaces to try and reduce the desire for vandalism and other behaviors that you want to discourage in public spaces. And we'll get back to more questions. Some of the couple of other considerations are just making sure sightlines are visible. So that main trail that goes through the park and connects them, it's important that you can see on either side of it, right? So you can see where you're going and you can see around you for a certain distance. It's an important, as we think of a first phase that might include the overlook at Beaton Hill down by the lower wetland, that you can actually see out to the overlook and back. Right, so if I'm going to go to a space, I have a way to get back out of that space, and I can see, or I know that I can see for a good long distance going to and from places. Those are probably the main core principles that we're addressing, but as final design occurs, you apply those principles as well as others to make sure it still feels as safe as we can. And then there's a question in the room here. Shelby, this one is going to be for you. The question in the room here is, what about cameras? Cameras in parks, or Kevin. Kevin's going to try and answer this one. Security cameras in parks. Let's make sure.
Right. Thank you. And good question. And at this point in the master plan process, we are not intending to put in security cameras. However, that is something that we would consider. Currently, there is a security camera in the treehouse in Big Rock Central. And so we did that primarily for vandalism control, and it's actually worked very well. It's been very successful. So I wouldn't say that it is that we wouldn't do it, but I would say it's not intended at this point. But with all the buildings that we have, particularly in Big Rock South, that is a possibility, just depending on if it's something that we feel that we need for safety and management of that space.
Thank you, Kevin. Do we have any more questions from the room? Yeah. The question, if the parks are going to be gated and closed at night.
Yes, we would manage them similar to the way we are managing most of our other parks. The exception being at Big Rock South, if events were happening, the gates, of course, would stay open until the events are concluded, but then they would be closed at night.
Thank you. Is there any other questions or comments from online? So the suggestion was to put the off-leash dog park next to the disc golf course. And then is there any other comments online too?
Yeah, we have a comment about the connector trails with a desire for them to be crushed rock so that a power wheelchair could travel across them. But can you expand a little bit about how we are keeping our trails accessible and potential materials used on the connector trails?
Yeah, so the main connector trail, sort of a primary connecting path from Big Rock south through Central and North, will remain a crushed rock trail. Similar to what the comment indicated, it is more accessible. So if you are strong enough for your own, or you have power, kind of powered wheelchair mobility devices, they function fairly well on those crushed rock surfaces. The challenge is maintaining them and keeping them to an accessibility standard. And over time, they don't meet full ADA accessibility without a very high level of maintenance that's just not practical in a typical park system. So when we start talking about accessible trails, we recognize the crushed rock. We don't want a full paved path all the way through these nature parks. And that may be something that is considered, long-term if accessibility and the need continues to grow. But we do need to have fully accessible paved paths to all of the main programmatic spaces within each park independently. So the connector path would be gravel. The smaller woodland trails would be mulch. Those would not be accessible. And then the paved paths, with being asphalt or concrete we talked about earlier, are just focused in those core, more improved portions of the park. That helps us protect the more natural spaces, but still make sure people who aren't just mobility challenged, right, who don't have the power scooter and have to get themselves through places, still have access to those facilities. Was there another comment or question in the room here? I thought I saw a hand up before we went to the online again. Yes. Yeah, and actually we did include it as part of the master plan as well, because it is a really prominent feature now that limits the visibility into the park. So that we specifically call out. I'll admit, we have lower vegetation at street. And that's our indication to subtly and not so subtly say that that large hedge needs to be changed. I'm not going to say completely removed, although a lot of portion of it will need to be removed. But the point being that whether it's some portion of what's there or something completely new or a combination, you need to be able to see into the park. A majority of that hedge is likely removed. I hesitate to say all of it is removed because as you get to edges, you need views in, but you still want a little bit of protection to some of those spaces. The formal hedge is likely mostly gone though. Yeah, and so the question was what happens to the hedge at Big Rock South along the street. So for those of you online, I apologize. I forget to repeat those questions. And the reason we're focusing on this and specifically in the master plan, even calling attention to it, is because visibility into a park is one of the core principles of keeping that park safe. You have to be able to see in to see the activity that's happening. And the more visible activity is in the park, the less likely it becomes a space for the less desirable activities. So that crime prevention through environmental design and those sight lines I talked about on trails occur and are just as applicable at the edges of the park system as well. Thank you for asking that one. Are there other comments and questions from online? All right, we might be winding down. Anything else from the room here? Okay, we maybe had a next step slide towards the end. If we can flip to that. I want to call attention and we'll, for those of you in the room, there are some boards up in the back. You can see some of these a little bit closer since you don't quite have the benefit of the screen as close as our online folks do. How you can stay informed. There is QR, I can never remember. I start to show my age. The QR code for the City of Sammamish website, that will then take you to our online survey. The online survey will basically give you a chance to provide some feedback and comments on the preferred master plans. It also, however, has the phasing. And so we do really want to hear from the community on priorities towards those phasing and what you're interested in seeing start to happen first. And then Shelby, is there anything else I'm missing on some next steps?
Yes, so I would just like to encourage all of you that would like to provide additional input or feedback on our preferred plans to participate in our upcoming open house at Big Rock Park South. If you haven't been to the park yet, it will be open on March 11th from 12 to 2. Hopefully we have a sunny day for you to come and walk the park. We also are presenting the preferred plans to our Parks Commission on Wednesday, February 1st. If you would like to submit any feedback to public comment, as well as a meeting with our City Council on March 14th. There will be an opportunity to give public comment on these designs as well.
And then the dates would all be particularly for when the Big Rock Park South is going to be open, will be on the website. So that you
Correct.
can come back to the website and get those dates as well if you need to pass them along to all your friends and family and neighbors. We'll inundate Shelby out at the park. Okay, any last call out to those online? Is there any other questions or comments? All right, I'm seeing none from our folks who are helping with the meeting tonight. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the in-person and those of you who are watching from wherever you may be. The hybrid format is always a challenge, but it's also, I think, a lot of fun to be able to get more people involved. We will stick around for a little bit for those of you in the room. There's some boards in the back, and if you do have some follow-up questions, you'll have a little bit of chance to chat with us. Thanks again, everybody, and everyone have a good night.